The late evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Le Petit Bistrot, one of the most talked-about French restaurants in the city. A woman in her mid-30s stood at the entrance, her navy blue blazer and pearl necklace reflecting her refined taste. Despite the restaurant being only half full, she had been waiting at the reception desk for what felt like an eternity. She watched as other guests walked in after her, only to be greeted warmly and escorted to their tables right away. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, seemed to look right through her, busying herself with reorganizing menus that were already perfectly stacked. A waiter rushed past with a tray of sparkling water, not even acknowledging her presence. The woman checked her watch. 15 minutes had passed. She had made her reservation 2 weeks ago, even calling to confirm it that morning. Her fingers drummed lightly on the wooden reception desk, a nervous habit she'd developed over years of working in high-pressure environments. The supple tremor in her hand was barely noticeable, but it caught the hostess's attention, who exchanged a quick glance with a nearby server. The atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable. The soft classical music playing in the background seemed to mock the tension building at the entrance. A couple walked in, dressed similarly to her, and the hostess immediately sprang to life. "Good evening. Welcome to Le Petit Bistrot. Your table is ready right this way." The woman watched as they were led to a prime window seat, exactly the kind of table she had requested during her reservation. Taking a deep breath, she cleared her throat politely. "Excuse me, I have a reservation for 7:30. Her voice was steady and professional, carrying the authority of someone who had spent years in the restaurant industry herself. The hostess glanced up briefly, then looked back down at her computer screen. "I'm sorry, we're fully booked for the evening." The woman pulled out her phone, displaying the confirmation email. "I have my reservation right here. I even called this morning to confirm." The hostess's expression remained unchanged, her eyes now fixed on something in the distance. Another server walked by, deliberately taking a wide berth around where the woman stood. What the staff didn't realize was that this woman wasn't just any customer. The slight tremor in her hand that they had noticed, the one that had caused them to exchange knowing looks, wasn't what they assumed. Behind her composed exterior and designer outfit was someone who had revolutionized the culinary scene in 3 different cities. Her recipes had been featured in major food magazines, and her innovative approach to fusion cuisine had earned her multiple awards. The golden pendant around her neck, which she now touched absently, was a gift from her former kitchen staff when she received her first Michelin star. Just 6 months ago, she had been commanding a kitchen of 30 people, creating dishes that food critics raved about. But life had thrown her an unexpected curveball, one that had forced her to step away from the stoves and flames that had been her home for 15 years. More guests filtered in, each receiving the warm welcome that had been denied to her. The woman stood her ground, her posture straight but not rigid, her expression neutral but determined. She had faced countless challenges in professional kitchens, environments that were often unwelcoming to women in leadership positions. This situation was different, but the feeling of being judged unfairly was all too familiar. A young couple walked past her toward the bar, whispering and glancing in her direction. The woman caught fragments of their conversation, something about the strict door policy and recent incidents. She understood now. The staff had made assumptions about her based on the slight tremor in her hands, jumping to conclusions that couldn't be further from the truth. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. For years, she had been the one behind the kitchen doors, too busy executing perfect dishes to pay attention to the drama unfolding in the dining room. Now, standing on the other side, she was experiencing firsthand how quick judgments and prejudices could turn a simple dinner reservation into an exercise in humiliation. As the clock ticked past 8:00 p.m., the woman made a decision. This moment wouldn't be just about getting a table or proving a point. It would become something much more significant, a chance to bridge the gap between perception and reality, to turn misconception into understanding. The world of fine dining had always been her sanctuary. 15 years earlier, she had started as a line cook in a small Italian restaurant, working nights while studying culinary arts during the day. Her tiny apartment back then had been filled with cookbooks, their pages marked with sticky notes and stained with sauce splatters. She would practice knife skills for hours, turning carrots into perfectly uniform diamonds until her fingers ached. Her rise through the ranks hadn't been easy. Kitchen culture in the early 2000s wasn't particularly welcoming to women, especially in leadership positions. She remembered her first job as a sous chef, where male cooks would deliberately misplace her prep work or turn up the heat on her sauces when she wasn't looking. But she never let it show that it bothered her. Instead, she worked twice as hard, stayed twice as long, and learned twice as much as everyone else. The breakthrough came when she was 28. A famous food critic had visited the restaurant where she was working as a junior chef. The head chef was out sick that night, and she had to take charge of the kitchen. Her hands had been shaking then too, but from nervousness, not illness. The critic's review had called her mushroom risotto a revelation and her duck confit possibly the best in the city. 2 weeks later, she was offered her first position as head chef. That position had led to others, each more prestigious than the last. She transformed struggling restaurants into culinary destinations. Her signature style combined classical French techniques with Asian influences, a reflection of her mixed heritage that food magazines couldn't get enough of. She trained dozens of young chefs who went on to open their own successful restaurants, spreading her influence throughout the industry. The 3 Michelin stars came 5 years ago. She remembered that morning clearly, standing in her pristine kitchen, surrounded by her team, all of them holding their breath as she opened the email. The celebration had lasted all night, with champagne flowing freely and impromptu cooking contests breaking out among the staff. Even the dishwashers had joined in, attempting to plate their midnight snacks with the same precision they'd watched her demonstrate countless times. But success hadn't changed her fundamental approach to food and people. She still insisted on talking to local suppliers personally, visiting farms to check on the quality of produce, and teaching basic knife skills to new kitchen staff. Her restaurant had become known not just for its food, but for its culture. No screaming, no throwing pans, no bullying. She had created the kind of kitchen she wished she had worked in when she was starting out. The first signs of trouble appeared about 8 months ago. She noticed her hands would shake slightly when plating delicate garnishes. At first, she brushed it off as fatigue. Running a 3-star restaurant meant working 14-hour days after all. But then other symptoms appeared. Some mornings, her fingers would be so stiff she could barely button her chef's coat. There were days when lifting a heavy stock pot seemed impossible. The diagnosis came as a shock. The doctors used long medical terms, but the bottom line was simple: her body was attacking itself. The condition was rare, progressive, and while treatable, there was no cure. They told her stress would make it worse, and running a high-pressure kitchen was about as stressful as it got. She tried to adapt at first. Her team was incredibly supportive, stepping in when she needed rest, rearranging the kitchen layout to make things easier for her. But after a few close calls with hot pans and sharp knives, she knew she had to make a choice. 6 months ago, she had gathered her staff and announced her retirement. The food magazines had speculated wildly about the reason: burnout, a secret new project, family issues, but she had kept the real reason private. The hardest part wasn't leaving the kitchen. It was losing her identity. For 15 years, she had been chef. Now, standing in restaurants like this one, she was just another customer, and apparently not even a welcome one. The slight tremor in her hands that had once created masterpieces of culinary art was now being misread as something else entirely. She looked around the restaurant, taking in the careful plating of dishes as they passed by, the orchestrated dance of the servers, the subtle lighting that made everyone look their best. This was her world. She had helped build this industry, trained some of the people who were now running kitchens like this one. The fact that she was being judged and found wanting by the very world she had helped create was an irony that wasn't lost on her. The pristine dining room of Le Petit Bistro was starting to blur around the edges as fatigue began to set in. She had been standing for nearly 30 minutes now, and her body was reminding her why she didn't do this anymore. The condition that had forced her from her beloved kitchen was more than just shaky hands. It was an invisible battle that few people could understand. Most mornings now started with a careful routine. Her medications needed to be taken in a specific order, some with food, others without. The simple act of making breakfast, once a joyful expression of creativity, had become a calculated exercise in energy conservation. Some days, the coffee mug felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Other days, she couldn't feel the temperature of the water at all, making even basic cooking dangerous. She thought back to the first major episode, 6 months ago, in her restaurant kitchen. It had been a busy Saturday night, the reservation book completely full. She was plating her signature dish, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops with pearl onion puree, when her hands suddenly lost all strength. The hot plate had slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor and sending scalding sauce everywhere. Thankfully, no one had been hurt, but that moment had made her decision clear. She couldn't risk her staff's safety or her restaurant's reputation. The hardest part was the unpredictability. Some days she felt almost normal, like she could step back into a kitchen and command it with the same authority she'd always had. Those were the most dangerous days, the ones that tempted her to push too hard. She'd learned that lesson the hard way when she tried to cook a full dinner party for friends 2 months ago. She had ended up in bed for 3 days afterward, her body rebelling against the overexertion. Her medical team had explained that stress was like fuel for her condition. The more stressed she became, the worse her symptoms got. It was a cruel irony. The very passion and drive that had made her successful in the restaurant industry now worked against her. The doctors had suggested low-stress activities and gentle hobbies, as if she could simply replace the adrenaline rush of a busy kitchen with knitting or gardening. Tonight was supposed to be different. She had planned everything carefully, timing her medications perfectly. She'd rested all afternoon, knowing that even sitting through a long dinner would tax her energy reserves. The reservation had been made weeks in advance, specifically requesting a table close to the entrance to minimize walking. She'd even chosen her outfit strategically. Buttons instead of zippers, slip-on shoes instead of laces, everything designed to conserve energy for enjoying the meal. But now, standing here being ignored by the staff, she could feel her body responding to the stress. The familiar tingling was starting in her fingers, creeping up her arms. Her legs felt heavy, like she was standing in wet concrete. She knew these warning signs, her body telling her to sit down, to rest, to remove herself from this situation. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was pride, or maybe it was the understanding that if she left now, nothing would change. The restaurant's atmosphere, which she had initially found so elegant, now felt oppressive. The soft lighting that had seemed welcoming now cast shadows that made her feel invisible. The gentle classical music that had played when she arrived now seemed to mock the tension she felt. She watched as a server deftly carried a tray of champagne flutes past her, remembering when such movements had been as natural to her as breathing. In her old life, she would have already been in the middle of dinner service, calling out orders, tasting sauces, adjusting seasonings. Her hands would have been sure and steady, capable of the most delicate garnishes. Now, those same hands betrayed her, marking her as somehow less in the eyes of people who didn't know her story. The slight tremor that the hostess had noticed was just the visible tip of an iceberg of daily challenges. She thought about all the others like her, people with invisible conditions who faced judgment and dismissal every day. How many others had stood where she was standing, fighting battles that no one could see? Her reputation in the culinary world meant nothing in this moment. She was just another person being judged by appearances, reduced to a visible symptom that told only a fraction of her story. A wave of exhaustion hit her, and she leaned slightly against the reception desk. The movement caught the hostess's attention again, prompting another disapproving glance. The woman straightened her spine, drawing on the same inner strength that had carried her through countless challenging services in busy kitchens. She might not be able to command a kitchen anymore, but she still had her dignity, her knowledge, and most importantly, her voice. The truth behind the staff's behavior began to unfold like layers of an onion being peeled away. Through fragments of whispered conversations and meaningful glances exchanged between servers, the picture became clearer. The restaurant had recently faced a series of unfortunate incidents that had put everyone on edge. Just 2 weeks ago, a group of rowdy guests had caused thousands of dollars in damage during a busy dinner service. They had seemed perfectly fine when they arrived, but their behavior had quickly deteriorated. The incident had made local news, damaging the restaurant's reputation and leaving the staff traumatized. 3 expensive wine glasses had been broken, a vintage bottle of champagne had been dropped, and an antique painting had been knocked off the wall. The hostess, who couldn't have been more than 25, had been working that night. She had taken the brunt of the chaos, trying to maintain order while protecting other diners from the disruption. The experience had left its mark. Now she watched every guest with worried eyes, looking for any sign that history might repeat itself. The woman at the reception desk could piece this together from the way the staff moved, their heightened alertness, the supple communications between them. Having run her own restaurant, she recognized the signs of a team that had been through something difficult together. Their behavior wasn't personal, it was protective. They were trying to prevent another incident, another night of chaos, another hit to their reputation. But their protective instincts had led them astray. The slight tremor in her hands, a symptom of her medical condition, had been misread as something entirely different. The staff had seen what they were afraid of seeing, not what was actually in front of them. It was a classic case of pattern recognition gone wrong. When you're looking for trouble, sometimes you find it where it doesn't exist. She watched as a server carefully explained something to a table of guests, his body language apologetic but firm. Probably talking about their strict new policies, she thought. The restaurant industry was built on hospitality, but it was also built on trust. When that trust was broken by a few bad experiences, it could change how an entire establishment operated. Through the dining room windows, she could see the sun had completely set now. The street lights cast long shadows on the sidewalk outside, and the early evening crowd was starting to arrive in earnest. More guests filtered in, each one being subtly but carefully assessed by the staff. She noticed how they looked at people's hands, their walking patterns, their speech, all telltale signs they had been trained to watch for. The irony of the situation struck her again. In her years of running high-end restaurants, she had dealt with similar situations. She had trained her staff to be vigilant but not judgmental, cautious but not assuming. It was a delicate balance, one that was easy to lose when fear entered the equation. Now, standing on the other side of that equation, she could see how quickly assumptions could spiral into discrimination. A young server walked past with a tray of water glasses, his hands perfectly steady. The woman remembered training new servers, teaching them how to carry full trays without spilling a drop. It took practice, confidence, and most importantly, the right environment to learn. She wondered if anyone had given this staff the same kind of supportive training in handling difficult situations, in distinguishing between genuine concerns and unfair assumptions. The hostess was now on the phone, her voice low but clearly stressed. More reservations were arriving, and the woman could see the mental calculations happening, how to handle the growing crowd while maintaining their new, stricter standards. The pressure was visible in the tight line of the hostess's shoulders, the way she kept glancing at the door with each new arrival. In the kitchen beyond the swinging doors, she could hear the familiar sounds of a dinner service wrapping up, the clatter of pots, the sizzle of pans, the quick calls of behind and corner. These were the sounds of her former life, a symphony she had conducted for so many years. Now they served as background music to a different kind of drama playing out in the dining room. A couple walked in, greeted the hostess, and were promptly seated. Nothing about their appearance suggested they would cause trouble, so they passed the unspoken test. The woman watched this screening process with growing understanding. The staff weren't bad people, they were scared people, trying their best to protect their workplace in the only way they knew how. But in their fear, they had created a new kind of problem, one that was hurting innocent people like her. The moment everything changed began with a simple request. "Could I please speak with the restaurant manager?" the woman asked, her voice calm but firm. The hostess hesitated, probably expecting a complaint about the long wait, but finally picked up the house phone and made the call. A few minutes later, the manager emerged from the back office. He was tall and slim, wearing a perfectly pressed suit, probably in his early 40s. He walked with the confident stride of someone who had spent years in the hospitality industry. But as he approached the reception desk, something remarkable happened. His confident stride faltered. His eyes widened with recognition. The polite, professional smile on his face transformed into one of genuine shock. "Oh my goodness," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it really you?" The change in his demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Gone was the defensive posture that the rest of the staff had been carrying. Instead, he looked like someone who had just seen a ghost, but a welcome one. The hostess watched this transformation with growing confusion. She glanced between her manager and the woman, trying to understand what was happening. The other staff members nearby also started paying attention, their curious eyes drawn to this unexpected scene playing out at the reception desk. 10 years ago, the manager began explaining to his bewildered staff, "I was a line cook in Chicago. I was young, inexperienced, and honestly, pretty arrogant. I thought I knew everything there was to know about cooking." He paused, emotion making his voice slightly rough. "Then I met my new head chef." The woman smiled softly, memories of that Chicago kitchen flooding back. "You burned every sauce you touched for the first month," she recalled, her voice gentle with amusement. The manager laughed, running a hand through his hair in embarrassment. "I did," he admitted, "but you never yelled, never threatened to fire me. Instead, you stayed after hours to teach me the proper technique. You showed me how to feel the heat of the pan, how to read the consistency of a reducing sauce, how to trust my instincts while respecting the fundamentals." The staff had gathered closer now, their earlier suspicions forgotten in the face of this unexpected reunion. The hostess's face had drained of color as she realized their mistake. She looked down at her reservation book, probably seeing the woman's name there for the first time with new understanding. "This woman," the manager continued, addressing his staff directly, "revolutionized every kitchen she touched. She trained dozens of chefs who now run their own restaurants. She earned 3 Michelin stars. But more importantly, she changed how kitchens operate. She proved that you could create exceptional food without the screaming, without the abuse, without the toxic culture that so many of us thought was normal." The woman felt her cheeks warm at the praise. The tremor in her hands was still there, but now it didn't matter. The staff were seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time since she'd walked in. Their eyes held respect, curiosity, and more than a little embarrassment. "When I read about your retirement 6 months ago," the manager said, his voice softer now, "I couldn't believe it. None of us could understand why you'd step away at the height of your career." He paused, understanding dawning in his eyes as he noticed the slight tremor in her hands. "But now I think I'm beginning to understand." The hostess stepped forward, her face flushed with shame. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. We've had some difficult situations recently, and we've been extra cautious, but that's no excuse for how we treated you." The woman looked around at the gathered staff, seeing the mixture of embarrassment, respect, and curiosity on their faces. This was a teaching moment, she realized. Just like those late nights in Chicago, teaching a young cook about sauce techniques, this was an opportunity to help people learn and grow. The evening crowd was building outside, but for this moment, time seemed to stand still in the restaurant's entrance. The same space that had been filled with tension and judgment just minutes ago now hummed with a different energy, one of recognition, respect, and the possibility of understanding. "Perhaps," the woman said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded professional kitchens for 15 years, "we should talk about the difference between caution and prejudice and how to maintain high standards without losing our humanity in the process." The restaurant manager quickly transformed the private dining room into an impromptu meeting space. The evening sun cast a warm glow through the windows as staff members filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Some perched on chairs while others leaned against the walls, all eyes focused on the woman they had earlier tried to turn away. "I'm not here to scold anyone," she began, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she had used to train countless chefs. "What happened tonight comes from a place of wanting to protect this restaurant and its guests. That's not wrong. But sometimes our protective instincts can lead us to make assumptions that hurt innocent people." She held up her hand, letting them all see the slight tremor that had caused so much concern. "This shake in my hands, it's not what you thought. It's a medical condition, an autoimmune disease that forced me to step away from my own kitchen 6 months ago." She paused, letting that sink in. "But imagine if I had been someone else. Someone without my background, someone who couldn't command attention and demand explanations. How many others have walked away from here feeling ashamed or humiliated?" A young server in the back raised her hand hesitantly. 2 weeks ago, we had that terrible incident," she explained, her voice shaking slightly. "The guests seemed fine at first, but then—" She trailed off, the memory clearly still fresh and painful. The woman nodded understandingly. "Bad experiences leave marks on us. They make us cautious, sometimes overly so. But let me share something I learned from 15 years of running kitchens. There's a difference between being cautious and being prejudiced. She moved to the center of the room, her presence commanding despite her physical limitations. In my restaurants, we had systems to handle difficult situations. We trained our staff to look for specific behaviors, not assumptions based on appearances. We taught them to communicate with guests, not judge them silently. The hostess, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. But how do we know? How can we tell the difference between someone who might cause trouble and someone like you? That's exactly the right question, the woman replied with an approving smile. The answer is simple, but not easy. You talk to people. You engage. You give them the benefit of the doubt while staying alert for actual problematic behavior. Most importantly, you remember that every person who walks through that door is a human being with their own story. She went on to share stories from her own experience about the chef with Parkinson's who created amazing desserts, the server with a speech impediment who became one of her best sommeliers, the dishwasher with autism who kept the cleanest station in the kitchen. Each story illustrated how quick judgments could have robbed her restaurant of incredible talent. The staff listened intently as she explained different ways to handle concerning situations without resorting to discrimination. She taught them about body language, about open-ended questions, about creating a welcoming atmosphere while maintaining professional boundaries. It was the kind of training they should have received weeks ago, after the incident that had left them all so shaken. In my kitchen, she continued, we had a saying, judge the food, not the cook. In the same way, judge behavior, not appearances. Watch for actions that cause concern, not characteristics that make you uncomfortable. The slight shake in someone's hands might be a medical condition. The person who moves differently might be dealing with chronic pain. The guest who seems anxious might be gathering courage to celebrate a special occasion. As she spoke, she could see the impact of her words on their faces. Some staff members were taking notes. Others were nodding in recognition. A few had tears in their eyes, perhaps remembering their own experiences of being judged unfairly. The manager, who had been quietly listening from the corner, stepped forward. I remember when you taught me about sauce making, he said, addressing both his former mentor and his staff. You said the secret wasn't in following the recipe blindly, but in understanding the ingredients and respecting the process. Maybe that's true for how we treat people too. The woman smiled at the parallel. Exactly. Just like in cooking, you need both knowledge and compassion. Rules and guidelines are important, but they should be applied with understanding and humanity. As the impromptu training session continued, the energy in the room shifted. What had started as a moment of shame and embarrassment was transforming into an opportunity for growth and understanding. The staff began sharing their own experiences, asking questions, and offering suggestions for how they could do better. Through the windows, they could see the dining room filling up with the evening crowd. But for this moment, something more important than dinner service was happening. A group of people were learning to see beyond their fears and prejudices, to recognize the humanity in every person who walked through their door. 3 months after that transformative evening, Le Petit Bistro had become a different place. The physical space remained the same, the elegant lighting, the crisp white tablecloths, the soft music floating through the air. But the atmosphere had shifted in subtle yet significant ways that regular guests noticed and newcomers felt immediately. The hostess who had once turned people away based on assumptions now greeted every guest with genuine warmth. She had developed a knack for making people feel welcome, especially those who seemed nervous. The woman's own journey had taken an unexpected turn as well. While she couldn't return to the physical demands of running a kitchen, she had found a new way to influence the industry she loved. Her experience had opened her eyes to a need she hadn't fully appreciated during her years as a chef, the need for spaces that truly welcomed everyone, regardless of their physical conditions or limitations. 1 year after that pivotal night, Le Petit Bistro hosted a special dinner. The guests included people with various disabilities, medical professionals, advocacy group representatives, and industry leaders. The menu was created collaboratively by the kitchen team and their mentor, featuring dishes that celebrated both culinary excellence and accessibility. As she watched the diverse crowd enjoying their meals, chatting, and laughing together, the woman reflected on how a moment of discrimination had transformed into a movement of understanding. The tremor in her hands was still there, but it no longer defined her in anyone's eyes. Instead, it had become a reminder of how prejudice could be transformed into awareness and how one difficult evening could lead to lasting positive change. The restaurant industry, she realized, had always been about more than just food. It was about creating spaces where people could come together, share experiences, and feel part of a community. By making these spaces truly accessible to everyone, they weren't just serving meals, they were serving humanity itself.